Welcome back. This is going to be the last video in my current mini-series on why you should care if the gospel authors put their own words in Jesus' mouth. I will no doubt address this again later, but this is the last one in this current series. And this video is going to be about multiple attestation. There will be some overlap with my earlier video called, I believe, Multiple Attestation is Not a Knight on a White Horse. But I think there is enough to say about that repeating that and then adding some additional important information here is worth doing as part of the current series. Let me remind you again that if you are not a Christian, these videos are nonetheless relevant because I want you to become a Christian. I want you to consider it very seriously. And you have a right to know how strong the evidence is for particular doctrines. And I think a lot of times when apologists sort of are speaking to Christians and saying, don't worry about that, because after all, God gave us the Gospels and so forth. They're not thinking about the fact that if they want to reach out to a non-Christian, he's not going to presuppose that God gave us the Gospels. So we need to really emphasize this, not only for the sake of Christians, but also for the sake of anybody who's considering becoming a Christian. And it should matter whether the gospel authors made up things maybe that they thought Jesus believed, that they thought were correct interpretations of what Jesus was saying, and then put them into the mouth of the historical Jesus as if he really said them, without any indication otherwise. All right, so sometimes multiple attestation to a motif or a theme is brought up as if it just makes everything okay, and as though you can be sort of really cavalier about the individual stories, the individual sayings reported, etc., because, hey, we got all this extra evidence out there, so it doesn't matter. I've seen this again and again. Now, the first point I want to make as a probability theorist is that in the kind of case we're looking at here of multiple attestation, each attestation to an event or to the statement that Jesus, made some doctrinal claim, each attestation needs to have some force for what it attests. There are, in complicated other cases, situations where two pieces of evidence, neither of them have any individual force for some theory, and then you put them together and they're sort of greater than the sum of their parts, or even greater than the product of their parts. And when they come together, suddenly you have evidence for that higher level theory. I'm not going to go into that today because I don't think that's relevant to the kind of case we're talking about here. When we're talking about an event or a saying of Jesus or a teaching of Jesus, if you're going to invoke multiple attestation, each one needs to have at least some force for that hypothesis or that proposition that you're claiming. Okay, so that's something to know right up front, that if I'm going to question some author to the point where being reported in his document doesn't have any force at all by itself for what it reports, even some force, then, why am I counting the reports in that document as part of multiple attestation? And we'll see how that plays out as we continue here. All right. Secondly, most specific teachings of Jesus or events in the life of Jesus are not so wildly, overwhelmingly over-justified that we can afford to be really cavalier about the individual attestations. I'm going to contrast that with a real-world example because we like to bring in common sense here. My evidence for the existence of my husband, Tim, is overwhelming. That Tim exists, that he's not a figment of my imagination, is wildly over-justified. So if I were suddenly to realize, oh wait, Tim didn't really say that to me, I just had a dream where Tim said that to me. That would not, in any serious way, call Tim's existence into question. This is because I have so much evidence from so many different kinds of sources and events and so on over all the years that I've known him that Tim exists, that finding that one of my apparent memories is actually a dream is no big deal. And it's no big deal because it's just wildly overjustified. But to say that, for example, Jesus fed the 5,000. Now that's reported in 4 different Gospels, which is great. And I think they have some independence. In fact, I think they have quite a bit of independence. We'll get into this in a moment. If you're a critical scholar, you're kind of collapsing the synoptic reports anyway. But even aside from what you're collapsing as far as independence is concerned, 4 accounts isn't anything like the wild overjustification that I have that Tim exists. Notice, too, that even though I do think we're greatly overjustified in believing the Gospels to be what I've called reportage and reliable, we still have to look down and see what attestation we have from them to particular events and particular teachings and sayings. Okay, so if I have 3 people who all claim to be witnesses to a crime, and it turns out that one of them is not telling the truth, he's lying or deluded or whatever, okay, I've got 2 more, but that's a third of my witnesses gone at that point, okay? The attestation to that crime was 3 witnesses, even if they're all independent. So that's relevant, okay? We shouldn't just automatically be cavalier. This is especially true if we're looking for Jesus' own teachings, and we've talked about how Jesus' own teachings are data in a special way. So our justification for the proposition that Jesus himself personally, historically, taught some doctrine D is not going to be just wildly over the top justified. And we'll see some examples of that as we go on. All right. The third point, does your methodology consistently applied erase or call into question multiple of your witnesses all at once? If you're consistent about it. This is where I'm probably going to overlap the most to that Night on a White Horse video. So to continue our witness to a crime example, suppose you as the investigating officer have decided that people who come from a certain part of town are dishonest. You have some kind of prejudice against them. And I'm not even going to go into whether your prejudice may be completely irrational, but it's your methodology that you should kind of question people from that side of town. And then as you look down, you discover that all 3 of your witnesses are from that side of town. All right, so that your methodology consistently applied is calling into question all of your witnesses, not just one. Or you had 4, and 3 out of the 4 are all from that side of town. Or if your methodology is such that it calls independence into account, all right, then you're doing what I called collapsing. So, for example, the story of the centurion's servant, okay, critical scholars don't think we have multiple independent witness accounts to that. I think we do. I think that's why we get this different portrayal of whether the centurion came in person or whether he didn't. I don't think that's a result of somebody's deliberately misrepresenting. I think that's a sign actually of independence. But if you're a critical scholar and you think, no, if the same story is in these synoptic gospels, then we've only got one factual report, well then you only have one source. You've collapsed them. And this is especially relevant. I talked about this with the infancy narratives. If you're going to say this is multiple attestation to a tradition, okay, and by tradition you just mean, well, that by the time the Gospels were written, the Christians believed that, then you've really only got one source, okay, which is that tradition, okay? And then if they're making up a bunch of other stuff, that's not a sign of independence in access to the facts anymore. So that's another example of your methodology erasing multiple things at once by collapsing them into one. Or suppose that you put a big question mark over John. Suppose that you say, well, we know that John, elaborated or embellished Jesus' teachings, and he thought that was okay because he thought he was inspired by the Holy Spirit. What if most or all of your strongest indicators that Jesus taught this are found in John? Then you're not going to help yourself by popping up to multiple attestation, because that multiplicity is all in a document that you've put a big question mark over, and to where you're not allowing the assertion of something in that document to have any significant evidential force, even if it's not a miracle, even if it's just a teaching. All right, or suppose your methodology is that you're trying to use only what's acknowledged by critical scholars about, say, the resurrection. You're taking that method, and as it turns out, the critical scholars you're citing, every time it comes to some report that Jesus could be touched, or that Jesus ate with his disciples, that he showed them his scars, etc., the critical scholars like, oh, that's a sign of apologetic elaboration. Well, if you're trying to use the methodology that you're only using what critical scholars are allowing, you can't take care of that problem about Jesus' physical resurrection by popping up a level and going, well, all of the Gospels say something or other that seems to indicate that Jesus was physical and was physically present, so it's okay we have multiple attestation, because that's going to clash with your attempt to restrain yourself to what's acknowledged by critical scholars, and they're throwing out every single one of those gospel reports of Jesus being physically present. So those are some examples. Does your methodology erase or question multiple of your attestations at once? All right. Now I want to move into some other specific examples concerning teachings of Jesus, things Jesus taught, because this series is on why you should care if the gospel authors put their own interpretations into Jesus' mouth, made it look like he said them, when in fact, historically, in that context, he did not recognizably say something like that. So the first one is something I've already talked about a bit in this series. Only Matthew reports Jesus himself saying that there's any kind of exception to the prohibition on divorce, and that's the except for fornication. That's only found in Matthew. And it's pretty common for critical scholars, unfortunately even several evangelical scholars, to say that Matthew believed that Jesus was speaking hyperbole, and that scholar himself may think Jesus was speaking hyperbole when he said, that it's wrong to divorce and didn't mention any exceptions. So they think Matthew correctly attributed to Jesus the idea that there was an exception, even though Jesus didn't state it. Kind of a mind-reading thing, in a sense. Okay? So that, that puts quite a question mark over Matthew. And it's the only gospel in which that exception clause is reported. Also, does this surmise that Matthew was just divine, kind of thinking what was in Jesus' mind and putting it into Jesus' mouth? What effect does that have even on the teachings of Paul on divorce? We could say, well, Paul was in contact with the apostles, blah, blah, blah. But if the apostles themselves were just surmising that Jesus allowed for an exception, to what extent did that influence Paul? Now, I believe, and I think we have evidence in the stories in Acts about Paul being called as an apostle, which I think have evidential force. I believe that Paul was actually personally inspired by God. I think we have evidence for that. But we don't actually know always what proportion of his teaching was coming from his interactions with the apostles and what proportion was coming from direct revelation. He certainly insists that a significant amount is coming from direct revelation. But at least you can ask the question, like, okay, was there influence on the teaching on divorce? And if that was, in a sense, invented by Matthew because he thought he was reading Jesus' mind, what effect does that have upon Paul and upon our evidence from Paul? All right, another one. I know people are going to challenge me on this. I put this up on Facebook, and I've already had some fun interactions, even, with completely conservative people. But I'm just going to come right out and say this. All of Jesus' explicit teachings that he was pre-existent are in the Gospel of John. All of our reports that Jesus explicitly taught that he existed before his birth, okay, are found in John. Now, I've seen, what people have tried. And we go around and around about, high Christology and the synoptics and so forth. No, I don't think Jesus' use of the phrase Son of Man counts as an explicit teaching that he was pre-existent. There are really some further links in the chain there. And remember, last time we talked about how explicitness matters. Explicitness is evidential. All right? No, I don't think that if it just says, I have not come to bring peace into the world, I have come to bring a sword. Like just the phrase, I have come. Okay? Just that phrase, which is sometimes used in the synoptics. I think any prophet might say, I haven't come to do this, I've come to do this. It's somebody who thinks he's been commissioned by God. Now, we do have places in John where Jesus said, I have come down from heaven. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. That's not just I have come. Okay, that's telling you where he came from, or for this cause I was born into the world to bear witness to the truth. Okay, that's pretty explicit. And then, of course, most famously, before Abraham was, I am. Okay, but those are all in John. So when you're coming along and you're saying, well, John in particular, it's a loose paraphrase, very misleading phrase, but that John in particular felt licensed to take what he considered to be the implications of Jesus' views and put them into the mouth of the historical Jesus. Now we notice that all the explicit teachings reported by Jesus that he is pre-existent are found in John. So now we have a problem, and multiple attestation isn't going to solve that problem. Okay, if you're questioning John, this is why John matters. See, all of this that I'm doing in this series is meant to show you that it matters. And that's to get you to the starting block. Then you go and you say, okay, it matters. Now, what is our evidence that the gospel authors didn't do this? And I think we have vast evidence that they didn't do this. And then you're going to have a much better opportunity to use multiple attestation because you're not questioning them in that particular way because you evidentially have decided that they didn't do that. Then when John reports that Jesus says, before Abraham was I am, that's good evidence that he actually said it, that he actually taught that he was pre-existent. Okay? But if you're cavalier and you just say, oh, it doesn't matter, we in something, the gist, multiple attestation, now you don't have that data anymore of Jesus teaching that he was pre-existent explicitly. All right. And the last one I'm going to do right now is eternal security. All right, now this is an interesting case because without going into a lot of theological detail, my own personal belief after, I've sort of wrestled with this in the scriptures, I'm trying to be biblical, is that even though there are proof texts on both sides and a lot of things in the epistles, which I take seriously theologically, because I do believe that those apostles received that commission from Jesus. but they're not putting it in Jesus' mouth. My own conclusion is that you can apostatize, but that it's hard to apostatize. All right, you can deconvert, and even if you were sincere before, in that sense, you can lose your own salvation. So I'm not a Calvinist, but at the same time, that you shouldn't be sitting around going, in anguish. Could I sort of accidentally commit the sin against the Holy Spirit and be lost forever and go to hell? Could Satan come and sort of steal my soul in the night, as it were? Or, you're catastrophizing. What if I were tortured, and in the middle of torture, I said something blasphemous, to make them stop the torture? Like, am I eternally lost at that point? Okay? And that's where I think the teachings about eternal security are really important. I also want to emphasize, again, I am not saying that teaching in the epistles, like Paul's teaching in Romans on this topic, or John's teaching in 1 John on this topic, is of no evidential value. I think it has important evidential value. And one of the reasons, again, is because those authors are not pretending that they're just giving you what Jesus explicitly taught. They're being honest about the fact that they're personally, they believe they're personally inspired, and I think they were personally inspired, but we need to keep our types of evidence separate. If we are talking about that special type of data that comes from Jesus' own teaching and Jesus' explicit teaching, so explicitness is evidential and Jesus' teaching is data in a special way, this is much better taught in John than in any of the other Gospels. In fact, I don't think, and I have been unable to find, as in the case of explicit teachings of pre-existence, I've been unable to find any explicit teaching of Jesus that you're secure with him forever if you are one of his own in the synoptic Gospels. All right, I'm saying explicit here. There are multiple explicit verses about this reported in John. He that comes to me, I will not in any way cast out. No man will pluck them out of my Father's hand. Okay? My Father who gave them to me is greater than all. That's about my sheep hearing my voice. Okay? So these teachings, they're comforting, but they're all found in John. Okay? And that's important, because then if your methodology is to go question mark, question mark, question mark over each teaching in John, unless it meets some other, separate individual passage by passage, teaching by teaching criterion, you're casting a lot of doubt there. And I've mentioned this elsewhere. I got an email from someone some time ago where he thanked me for my evidential defense of John's reliability, because he said he went through a period where he worried that he had accidentally committed the sin against the Holy Spirit. And he was lost, and, that caused a lot of anxiety for him. And he was greatly comforted by that statement, he who comes to me, I will not cast out, found in John. So it's important, it matters that we have this explicit teaching by Jesus. It's helpful. It strengthens our evidential case, but it also raises the, shall we say, stakes for just taking John and kind of going, I don't want to use John. Critical scholars have questions. John sometimes elaborated, etc., but somehow that's all okay. And I could give other doctrines, but I'm coming up on 25 minutes here, and I'm going to stop. You can probably think of some other doctrines yourself that are taught by Jesus explicitly and clearly only in one gospel, or much more strongly in one gospel than in any others, to where if you called that into question, it would weaken your cumulative case for that teaching. So this is why it matters. So I hope that's given you some pause if you've been in the habit of saying, oh, well, we have multiple attestation. That indeed, as I said before, multiple attestation is not a knight on the white horse to rescue you after you've thrown away your weapons and your armor and so forth, and you're completely vulnerable, and don't really have the data to back up what you're saying. Multiple attestation is often not going to save you. So I'm not sure what my next series is going to be, but I hope you'll come back next time to the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.